The unknown dead child of the Titanic. On April 21, 1912, the crew of the recovery ship Mackay-Bennett was met with a disturbing and horrifying sight. They had already retrieved 3 bodies from the Titanic disaster when the body of a small child slowly drifted past their boat. Surrounded by wreckage, the sailors saw a boy of about 2 years old with blonde hair. He was floating face up in the water. It was as if he were just sleeping, but he was dead. His mother had carefully and warmly dressed him in a coat with a fur collar over a woolen undershirt. His small legs were also perfectly protected from the cold in a frock coat, knee socks, and a pair of brown shoes. The finders lifted the boy on board almost tenderly, but the sight was too much even for the hardened sailors who had seen a lot. They couldn't hold back their tears, as reported by the Morning Chronicle newspaper from Halifax. For the coroner, however, it was a case like any other. He began his report quite soberly. Number 4, male, estimated age 2, blonde hair, clothing, no other markings, likely 3rd class. Nevertheless, no other Titanic victim would later receive as much sympathy as the unknown dead child. And it all started with the sailors. The crew of the Mackay-Bennett made a vow. If no one claimed the child, they would ensure a proper burial. That's exactly what happened. The sailors pooled money for a gravestone and a white coffin made of zinc and pine. White was chosen as the color of innocence and purity. The local undertaker was also moved by the boy's fate. He made sure that the child was literally laid to rest with a small mattress and blanket in the coffin. All this took place 2 weeks after the recovery at Fairview Lawn Cemetery in Halifax. Many local residents and almost the entire crew of the recovery ship attended the funeral. The gravestone simply read, "Erected to the memory of an unknown child, whose remains were recovered after the disaster to the Titanic." But who was the unknown child? And why did he die alone, even though his mother had quickly dressed him warmly to protect him from the icy cold? The identification began with a research project by the University of Ontario in 2001. The goal was to determine the names of all unidentified Titanic victims. 6 small children had been reported missing in total, making them candidates. Contemporaries of the disaster were certain that the unknown dead child must be a 2-year-old Swedish boy. His case would deserve its own story, as neither he nor his mother could secure a place in a lifeboat. According to eyewitnesses, his mother even had to watch as he was swept overboard by a wave and sank into the icy waters. But when the DNA samples from the dead boy were compared with the relatives of all the child victims, it quickly became clear that it was not the Swedish child. Instead, it was a 13-month-old Finnish boy. Doubts arose when a pair of weathered brown leather shoes were donated to the Titanic Museum in Halifax. These shoes should not have existed. The belongings of Titanic victims were destroyed after the disaster to prevent souvenir hunters from being attracted. During this police-supervised action, however, one officer couldn't bring himself to throw the small shoes into the flames. They remained with his family until his grandson contacted the museum. After a thorough examination, the museum was certain. These were the shoes mentioned by the coroner in 1912 when describing the unknown dead boy. But these shoes were far too big for the 13-month-old Finnish boy. This revealed that the DNA test had been faulty. A repeat test showed that the 19-month-old Sidney Leslie Goodwin was the unknown dead child. Born in Britain, he boarded the Titanic with his parents 5 days before the disaster. This photo is, by the way, the only surviving image of him. It was taken when Sidney was around 1 year old, about 6 months before his death. The Goodwin family had booked a passage in hopes of starting a new life in America. Sidney's father had already secured a job at a hydroelectric plant in Niagara Falls. In addition to young Sidney Leslie, the Goodwins had 5 other children, aged between 9 and 16. Tragically, not a single family member survived the sinking of the Titanic. But how did the odd discovery of the little boy come about? As it turned out, the coroner was correct in assuming that the Goodwins were 3rd-class passengers. Very few of these survived, as escape routes were often blocked or even sealed off. For many, the ship became a deadly trap immediately. Others reached the deck too late as the lifeboats were already full. It is believed that the parents could not save themselves, but gave their youngest child to another passenger in a lifeboat. In the chaotic scenes when the boats were lowered, the child may have fallen from the boat. It is also assumed that the child's body floated face up and unscathed on the water because he was placed on a buoyant object, perhaps a life jacket. This base was not mentioned or noted by the recovery crew. The cause of death was not further investigated, as it was assumed that all Titanic victims had drowned. However, this probably didn't apply to Sidney Leslie Goodwin. It seems that the little boy, who drifted unnoticed for 6 days, likely died of dehydration or exposure. Given the freezing temperatures at the disaster site, the latter seems more probable. For over 110 years, Sidney Leslie Goodwin has been resting in his grave at Fairview Lawn Cemetery in Halifax, surrounded by about 120 other Titanic victims, whose graves are arranged in the shape of a ship's bow. Even after the boy was identified, the gravestone referring to the unknown child was left unchanged, undoubtedly out of respect for this historical memorial. However, an additional plaque now displays the name and birth date of the little English boy. But one thing hasn't changed at all. The boy's grave is by far the most popular among cemetery visitors. Almost daily, visitors leave stuffed animals, flowers, and coins at the grave. According to the cemetery staff, not even vagrants have ever dared to take anything from it. This shows how the fate of Sidney Leslie Goodwin continues to touch the hearts of people to this day, and probably for deep-rooted reasons. His story reminds us that behind every statistic there are many moving individual fates, and that every person who left too soon had a unique and valuable life ahead of them, and only this one. That was the story of the unknown dead child of the Titanic. If you liked it, please leave a comment and a like.